Stand by, folks. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage your moderator, Gideon Mann, head of data science, Bloomberg LP.
Good morning. Please welcome Natalia Adler. I'm gonna bring everybody on, and then we're gonna chat a little bit. And please welcome Jackie Harris. And finally, Mike Flowers. I think this is the only time you will ever see me dressed better than Mike.
I don't think that's true.
So please enjoy. Okay, so this panel is going to be on citizenship and the changing nature of citizenship with data as data becomes more a part of our cities. And so on the stage with me are three wonderful individuals who have all been in the private sector and in government and have experience on both sides. And so first, I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves, say where they're coming from. I guess I should start with me. My name is Gideon Mann, as the voice of God so declared. I'm the head of data science at Bloomberg LP. I work on predominantly the strategy for the core product, is the terminal product. But I also run a conference in the fall called the Data for Good Exchange. And the Data for Good Exchange is a meeting where data scientists from industry and academia get matched with people from the public sector and try to look for opportunities where data can be useful and helpful, and also increasingly places that we should be aware of potential problems, threats to privacy, threats of bias, and so on. So that is a short bit about me. Let me turn it over to Natalia.
Hi, good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Natalia Adler, and I work for UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Fund. And we have been around for a while, for 70 years to be precise. Not me, obviously, but UNICEF has. And throughout this time, we have learned three things in particular. The first one, to deal with the kinds of problems affecting children around the world, we need data. We need lots of data. And we need data to untangle and decode these complex problems. Otherwise, we're paralyzed. We can't do anything. The second thing that we have learned is that some of the data, and especially the most relevant data to untangle those complex problems, currently sit with corporations in the form of web clicks, search queries, like buttons. And three, for as much as we like data and we want data, data is only the raw materials. In the end of the day, we want collaborations and expertise to help translate all that raw material into something that is insightful and knowledgeable so that we can actually make a difference. And for that, we need, it takes a village, so that's why we're here today.
Jackie, please.
Hello, thank you for being here today, and I'm really excited to speak with you. My name is Jackie Harris. I work for a company called Democracy Live. We're the largest provider of balloting services to military and overseas voters from the United States. We provide electronic ballot delivery. We also provide a number of accessible data services for voters with disabilities and for the general public. I've worked for the government side of the house for about 25 years. This is my 28th year in elections administration. So I've pretty much seen the whole gamut. I've done everything from work as a poll worker at the polls to do international observation missions overseas. So I've had a chance to really explore this space, and I know where a lot of the data is. As a vendor now is working with local governments to try to provide these services to them, one of the things that we've come to understand is the need to really understand our customers' needs and what they have the ability to provide to us. And we've learned we need to make sure that we're learning the language that they speak in their industry and not just come in and say, hey, we've got a great solution for you and provide us this, that, and the other thing, and then try to train them on what we need to learn what they have available to us and find a way to incorporate that into our products and services to make sure that we're serving the populations that they want to serve.
Thank you. And Mike?
Hi, I'm Mike Flowers. I have a kind of tortuous job history, but for relevant to this panel, I'm currently Chief Analytics Officer at a data and data technology startup here in New York City called Enigma. And prior to that, I was Chief Analytics Officer under Mayor Bloomberg for the City of New York. At the end of the day, the issue was really, I think Natalia sort of touched on it really perfectly. The job and the missions of both organizations really are about taking our data and leveraging that into an enterprise decision-making asset. And that sounds sort of, I don't know, like business perspective-y way of basically saying we need to service or allocate our resources to servicing whoever it is paying us to do our jobs. From Enigma's standpoint, by and large, we work with Fortune 500 companies in order to take their ocean of ontologies of data, synthesize them into something that where you can take shipping information and actually have that drive market research and vice versa. With the city, the same thing. It was how do I take our tax data and turn that into a fire prevention mechanism? And at the end of the day, it really just comes down to not just collecting and synthesizing that data, but applying just basic anthropology to understand that the reality that data purports to reflect is it really fully reflected by the data? At the end of the day, there are human beings making these decisions for and on behalf of human beings, and there's sort of a fundamental understanding that needs to be made when working with this data in order to achieve that outcome. At the end of the day, we just want to service people better. You make better decisions in order to do better at what you're being paid to do or what you've sworn to do as a public servant. So I'm really kind of, when Gideon asked if I could do this, I was really kind of excited to talk about that specific issue because I think this is a perfect panel for it.
Thank you, Mike. If we were talking and we were talking about some of the things that happened in the city of New York when you were here, where technology really had an impact in changing the way that citizens relate to government and kind of increasing the benefit of citizens. Would you talk a little bit about maybe some examples about how you saw that happen?
In New York City, this Navy Yard's a great example of it to a certain degree. A lot of that effort, I think Dan Doctoroff is speaking here today, right? I think Dan spearheaded a lot of that effort. There's a lot of that happened under Mayor Bloomberg, which was basically a determination to how do we take our spaces and optimize them for the information economy, right? This is a remarkable monument to 20th century American industrial might. But the market changed, and the job makeup in New York City changed. And rather than allow this place to turn into either a weed-strewn parking lot or high-end condos, how could we have that turn into something that could, grow our tax base? And the idea was born to make this a maker space and a technology incubator space and a number of other really wonderful things. None of that, could have happened absent the leveraging of all the information that the city has available to it. And it's not just a matter of the city's information. In other words, not just our 911 data and our 301 data and our property tax data and our water usage data, blah, 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 blah. But there's a lot of other data available to the city because it happens in the city. It's just not under control of the mayor of the city of New York, as powerful an actor as that person is, right? So you have to then leverage state data and federal data and private sector data and then turn that into a spigot of insight that can go to the people who have to decide, okay, well, how do I go about acquiring this space and turning it into something that will get a greater return for the citizens of the city of New York? That's just one kind of macro example. A more granular example was simply just a matter of, allocating limited prophylactic resources to where they're going to have the greatest preventative impact, right? Again, that's sort of a fancy way of saying, where do I send my inspector, right? So if I've got to do an audit and I've only got like 150 auditors available to me, and I'm sure in Charlottesville that sounds like a lot, but it's a big city, right? So, the idea is, well, I got to pick which of these companies, these 250 some odd thousand companies that operate in New York City, that I should scrutinize to determine whether or not they're paying their fair share. You can't do that absent analytics. It's just not possible to accurately get the best ROI from your audit hour unless you do more than just shotgun blast into that 250,000. So what the city ended up doing was saying, okay, well, these guys didn't file last year, but they just applied for a waste hauling license. So they're still alive, we should go look at them. It's very commonsensical, right? And you're applying human insight to it, the expertise of your auditors, stuff they already know how to do, but giving them access to better information to make those decisions that at the end of the day inure to the benefit of the people of the city.
Jackie, you had talked a little bit about kind of broadening the base of citizens and figuring out how to have the mission of the government be more targeted to citizens. How does Democracy Live have a role in that?
Well, as I said, we do a lot of delivery of balloting services right now to our military and overseas voters, and that's a very targeted group. But we realize that the same information that we're drawing in from our jurisdictions, their balloting information, their voter registration information, their districts, all the different things, maps, et cetera, that we pull from various entities, can also be leveraged to serve the greater population. One of our targets is to improve the availability of election data to individuals with disabilities. And we can take that same data that we're using for the military and overseas voters and create accessible sample ballot information, accessible voter guides, accessible ballots themselves that can be distributed. We also look at that as an opportunity to provide continuity of operation planning, in that we're developing this electronic ballot delivery systems, which can be delivered, at short notice because the infrastructure is already there. You could do that on short notice in an emergency situation. Most of the states have the opportunity to expand the role of absentee voting in the case of a natural or other type of emergency. Virginia actually utilized that during Hurricane Sandy. They exercised the authority to expand absentee voting to our local electrical workers who came up here to assist with the recovery efforts. So we realized that the information that we're pulling in for this one purpose has this ability to be deployed in a number of ways to expand access to voter information and balloting for all citizens, not just this one targeted group that we originally funded for. And that's where we're always looking for ways to utilize the information that we acquire to expand that access. But we realize that in order to do that, we really need to bring in all of our stakeholders. And so when we say we want to expand disability services, then we're working with the Federation for the Blind and with universities and with advocacy groups across the board. We're talking to LA County saying, what do you do if you have a blind citizen who's speaking Chinese? There's the nexus of language requirements and accessibility services, and how do I take your balloting data and make sure that it's audio accessible in another language? So that's where we're bringing in as many of the local folks as we can and the local advocacy groups to help guide our mission to make sure that we're not just coming down from above and saying, hey, we got a great idea. You guys should just, do these things we want you to do. We really want to make sure that we're getting information from the locals and serving their needs and meeting the needs of their local constituents.
Natalia, when you opened, you talked a little bit about the need for collaboration around data between government entities and private entities. Could you talk a little bit about how you think about that? How do you condition that for success, and maybe some examples where you're pursuing that?
Sure. As I said earlier, we are in the business of trying to translate complex problems into practical solutions. But we have to recognize that we cannot do it alone. In fact, no single government, no single city, no single institution will be able to do it alone. I think in the course of these 70 years, we have come to understand that there's no big solution to a big problem. There's a series of small solutions that, as part of a combined effort, make up the solution. And so when we're talking about data and this whole data revolution kind of discourse, we are very much behind in terms of data science. UNICEF is an organization that has over 15,000 people around the world. We have presence in 192 countries. And we have, at the moment, 3 consultants who are data scientists. So if we want to really reap the benefits of all this data that is out there, how do we do that? We have tried to hire some data scientists. Gideon knows about that, and Bloomberg has helped us in that endeavor. But you know what happened? We can't compete with Facebook. We really can't. In fact, we lost one data scientist to Facebook. So how do we do it instead of just, again, sitting and doing nothing? We created this initiative called Data Collaboratives with GovLab at NYU. And essentially, Data Collaboratives is a form of collaboration that brings not only data, especially from private sector, but also expertise from private sector, from academia, and even like involve citizens in general. And we do that in a way that, one, we start with problems, and we're dealing with the most complex problems around the world, from climate change to the refugee crisis. And we really bring all these people together, all these organizations together to really try to tackle these problems. I'll give you one example that is very much linked to cities. It's the growing number of childhood obesity. When we're talking about childhood obesity, if we look at this problem just from a consumption perspective, which most companies or organizations tend to do it, we're missing the entire picture. We need to look at food production, food access. We need to look at how companies, especially sugary drinks and junk food companies, advertise their products, where they advertise. We need to look at grocery receipts to understand food consumptions. Can one organization do all of that? No. So we are partnering with supermarkets to use data science to read these grocery receipts to understand how a specific neighborhood, what are the food patterns there. We're looking at satellite data to see how children have access to green space, looking into partnerships with Move It or Waze and different kinds of organizations to see how they're moving in a city. So again, it's just like spreading this sort of responsibility across. And I think in the way that we are so connected, and cities are very much connected as well, we needed to also spread the solution across many different parts.
Thank you. Mike, now you said to me recently that not just politics is local, but data is local. So what do you mean by that?
Wow, okay. I guess what I'm trying to say is that in order for data to be useful, I think you've seen this sort of movement, right? And try and keep it in spirit with the point of this panel, which is really about like the citizen, right? And what it means to be a citizen now. And the fact of the matter is the most useful data that I have worked with, private or public sector, has by and large been able to drill down as granularly as possible to where people live, right? Or where people work, or where they're doing what they do. And that means, like, you know, building permit data is a mother lode in terms of getting a sense of how a city is developing. And I see a gentleman who used to work with me in the audience right now that did a lot of work with that. It's good to see you, man. How are you? That, you know, 911 data. 911 data is an incredibly granular look at the way a city is behaving on a minute-by-minute basis. And it's hyper-local. I have a fire at 332 East 19th Street, gunshot here at this, you know, corner in Queens, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So what I meant by that, really, at the end of the day, is that, like, a lot of government data up until about 10, 15 years ago focused much more on the high level. How many widgets did we deliver? How many people do we have in this state? You know, that is useful for macro purposes, but if you're going to use it to make like really granular local city level decisions, is fairly useless.
No, I was going to jump on this because, again, data access is probably the key here as well. Do you always have access to that kind of granular data? I mean, that's always the question, right? So, for example, in Santiago del Chile, we're working to try to see if gender plays a role in the way that people move in cities. We kind of think that it does, but we want to actually base that on evidence. And how do we get that data? How do we get that kind of data that tells us in that granular level if there is an indication that gender plays a role? So we are actually partnering with Telefonica, and they're using cell phone data anonymize and aggregate the data, but still over 1 million inhabitants, and they have the level of granularity to not only see if there are any indications that people and girls and women are moving differently in cities, if they're moving at different hours, and we're trying to cross that information with transport options to see if they are responding as well. So that it goes back, like, do we have access to data? Do we need to always create it? Or are there companies or other organizations there that have the data that can actually help? And in this particular case, it's not a humanitarian situation, but when there are cases about disasters, recovery, then access to those data sets become incredibly important.
But the way, I totally agree, but the way you sort of reacted when you were talking about anonymized, I think it's sort of a nod to the recognition that there's a high level of creepiness to this to a lot of people. And I think I think the answer to that is not necessarily use or don't use the data. I think there's obviously a very fair, rigorous, and reasonable debate about that. My own view is I think you just have to, the users must be hyper-transparent back to the used, right? And to the extent possible, give those people the right, to know how it's being used, and sort of a measure of control over it. Because otherwise, that contract's going to fall apart. Like, the only way it works at the end of the day is if people, are continuously okay with it. I mean, it sort of shocks me to a certain degree how okay people are with letting Google know every facet of their lives, right? I find it shocking, and then on the other hand, if a state elections person uses it to draw a boundary, it's like you're going to get your clearance yanked and your job, thrown out. So the way we sort of allocate our outrage is a little off to me to a certain degree, but at the end of the day, the only way these things are really going to work is if there's hyper-transparency about usage back to the people whose data that reality reflects.
Yeah, I'd like to speak to that because the creepiness factor certainly comes into play with elections, and because everything is about perception. And certainly in the last, decade, as I've been in this business, you see the increased politicization of what we're doing. So when we're collecting data, we're talking about, military voters and how they're responding, and tracking data on whether voters with disabilities are responding to certain efforts. You are starting to get into some data that people feel very uncomfortable that you've collected, and we need to just make sure that we're always as transparent as possible, but always being very, very, very careful about the perception that the data that we're collecting is somehow intruding into someone's political beliefs. Elections, despite what people may think, is not a political process in itself. It should be utterly apolitical. You're there as an administrator of a system that serves a political function, but we have to be extraordinarily careful about what we're collecting, how we store it, how we, communicate it, and even with our customers, they're just highly sensitive. We would never even reach out and be like, oh, congratulations on so-and-so for using our product today. We would never do that without clearing it with the customer first, because people are so cautious about their messaging that we have to stay pretty much in the background, which is hard for a private industry to say, oh yeah, we'll stay in the background, because people like to toot their horn. But we just need to make sure that it's always the voice of the local administrator to their local constituents. And again, that's the citizenry needs to be served first before the needs of our company to toot our horn.
Natalia, do you have anything you want to add about all of the rights, the responsibilities of government to use data responsibly, I guess internationally, that you've seen?
Well, I think a very tweetable quote is that creepiness is relative. As Mike said, if you are signing on to any Google program and you're check the box for the terms of reference, probably you're not even reading it, so you don't care how they use your data. But when it comes to creating data, using data, especially private sector data for social good, it becomes people get really, really nervous. And that's okay now, because we understand that we're entering new territory. On a normative level, I think it's fair to say that we have fundamental rights when it comes to data. There are at least 5 rights that have been enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and many other international human rights conventions to which pretty much every single country in the world has ratified.
Well, which are those? Yeah.
The first one is very simple, right to information, and that applies not only to access information, but also to transmit and also to benefit from that information. And that applies to all the data life cycle. The other one, every single human being has a right to have their protection against harms in the use of ICTs and data. We also have the rights to have our personal data used in a way that is consistent with international norms of ethics, legal and technical standards of privacy and data protection. We also have rights to the agency over the collection and the use of data. This applies to consent. And finally, we also have rights to rectification when our data is used in an improper way. That's the normative aspect. It's important because it really lays down the ground for what we're talking about. However, as we have more new technologies being developed, those lines between what is private, what's public becomes very blurred. And on top of that, we also have to reconcile, and cities have to reconcile especially, their desire to participate in a data economy, in a knowledge economy, with the protection of these rights over personal use of data. So there's still a lot that needs to be done, but there are two things that are very important here. One, we have already seen that the market forces alone will not correct some of these things and try to come up with solutions for this. Definitely we need some new policies on this, but I would caution the way to actually develop these policies, because we don't want to also lay a heavy hand and prevent progress from taking place. So the best way to go about it is to try to do a little bit of a trial and error. What are some of the cases where these data sharing works? Where is it needed? Where is it creating public value? What are some of the issues that are coming out? So it's almost like, you learn by doing. The European Commission has just last month done really interesting work, inviting tons of experts to discuss these issues, and there are many issues that come to mind. The client trying to define what is personal and non-personal data, what are some of the boundaries with consent, and so I think all of that has to be decided, but we need to also see in real practice how this works, and that goes back to the work that we're trying to do with these data collaboratives. See what works and see how we can learn from that so that we can enact the legislation and policies on that.
Mike, if I could ask you, have you, when you think about your work now at Enigma, how do you think about projects which both respect citizen privacy and then also kind of add to the overall value, or how are you thinking about that now?
So there's a kind of come at it from a couple of directions, right? So there's some work that we do directly with cities that is more philanthropic than anything else. But to be clear, the philanthropy is highly, I would call it enlightened self-interest, right? The reality, so one of the cities that we ended up doing a lot of work with is the city of New Orleans. Honestly, because a good friend of mine happens to be the head of analytics there. And so I understood that at least the cultural, political, and legal support was going to be there for us to go in and do something. One of the first things we did, we had to pick a project that allowed them to understand the value of what we were talking about, but that also would immediately speak to a real problem. And what we ended up doing was smoke detector placement with them. And they have this, and this is sort of it's an interesting confluence of problems. A lot of cities gauge how they allocate their resources based on citizen outreach, reach out, right? Like somebody calls and they'll respond, right? Whether it's emergency or non-emergency. Well, New Orleans had this thing where they had a bunch of smoke detectors that they wanted to give out, but they only gave them out to people who called, right? But in order to do an outreach in a city that big, then you're talking about either really partnering up with a robust NGO or having your fire department do it, and the firemen weren't particularly keen on going out and knocking on every door in the city when they actually have to fight fire. So we leveraged federal and local data, specifically census data and ACS data at the federal level, and local data in terms of incidents and some fires, and then figured out where the best ROI on the door knock would be for them to install a detector based on the presence of at-risk people and the riskiness of the structure itself. And it was a smashing success for very minimal effort. it gave, it's already kind of racked up a few lives in terms of lives saved. There were fires at places they had like a week earlier placed a smoke detector, which is a great win for the city, but also for the firemen. They're going to places that they, in a more sedate manner to collect information about a location that later on they have a higher likelihood of running into under emergent circumstances. So everybody wins in that circumstance. That's what I'm always looking for in kicking off these projects. The reason I did it personally, or I thought it was a good thing for Enigma to do, the self-interested part of the Enlightenment, was the more granularly we can get our arms around local conditions, the more excited the people who are willing to pay us will be to pay us to provide that insight, right? And we were very transparent and open and honest with the city about why we were doing this in the first place. It was just a very kind of upfront, arm's length transaction, which is why I think private sector has to work if you're going to work with them. Like, not just like, oh, they're being nice to us, because they can always just pull the rug from you, or they're not just telling you why they're doing it, like Waze, right? I think one really interesting thing about Waze is I have a lot of respect for the cities that are leveraging that information. I think it's a really smart, clever thing to do. But don't forget that Waze is in this to make a buck, right? And that's okay. That's the way the system has to work.
Jackie, when you moved from government into industry, when you went over to the dark side, were there any big surprises for you, how did you think about that move?
I think it was probably a bigger surprise for the company that hired me, but not too big of a surprise. Actually, the gentleman who's the president of our company, Brian Finney, had attempted to sell me voting equipment in his prior life many times, and never was successful in that venture because I'm a hard customer to sell. I'm a stickler for the law. I really want to kick the tires on whatever comes my way. So I think he brought me on as his toughest customer, knowing that internally I sit around the table there going, no, you can't do that. No, that's not the right way of doing it. Of course you can't. I'm the naysayer at the table, but I think that was a good role for me, and I think the company has benefited from it, and I think that our customers appreciate that and respect it, because I've been in the industry long enough and been engaged in enough activities that a lot of people around the country know me from my former roles. So, it brought credibility to the table, and I think that's very important that, you can engage in that way and bring that credibility, because otherwise it's hard to walk in to someone within any industry and not have somebody on your team who at least can translate their needs, and speak their language and bring it to the table. Otherwise, you're just another somebody out trying to make a buck. So I think that, that was probably the hardest adjustment for the company, was for me to say, oh, but there's this law, there's this federal law that says if you move out of state within the 30 days before a presidential election, you're entitled to have your ballot in your own, like, what? All the different requirements. And I think that's another point that I like to make, is that you have to understand the constraints around what people are doing in their industry, and it's different in every country that you may visit or every city that you may work with. They've got their own set of constraints, financial and otherwise, that you really need to be cognizant of and realize that they are looking for that return on investment. You're trying to provide them a service, but there's a lot of other things that they're being asked to do, and you just need to understand, your hierarchy in that, needs-based system.
Okay, so we are coming up at the end of our time together. I will miss you guys. Natalia, do you want to say anything finally to wrap up?
Just to say, I'm surprised to say this because I'm not the only person here not from the private sector, but I don't have a problem with anybody trying to make a buck. I think that this kind of win-win situation is good for everybody. And I think the Waze example is actually fascinating because it's one example where Waze shares a lot of their own data with local cities around the world. And that enables these governments to be able to regulate speeding limits, for example. And in turn, governments share their own data when they have some blockages and road constructions, so that Waze in turns can then improve their systems to their customers as well. I think that's a really good example. And that kind of win-win situation, if everybody's winning, I think we're better off. In the end of the day, I think that what we're trying to do with data collaboratives is recognize those win-win situations for everybody, try to regulate whenever we can and be conscious about privacy and ethical issues. But in the end of the day, if we can go into that route, we're probably going to end up with something like, I don't know, a version of Airbnb for data sharing, which it sounds good with me.
Well, lovely. Well, thank you very much, guys, and thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, the next panel in this room will be on the future of urban design and begin promptly at 11:45. Thank you.